Jai. Thank
Hare
you for
Krishna,
joining.
Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Leela
Whoa. So, wow, wonderful week. It's 8 o'clock. We can get started. So, thank you, dear devotees, for joining this evening as we have our special guest on this special week. It's a holiday week, so a lot of devotees are off from work and so on. So we have a special guest, His Grace Radhika Prabhu. Is no stranger to this channel and to many other channels around the world, and so it needs no further introduction. But today's topic is a very interesting and intriguing one. The topic is Bhagavad Gita from the perspective of Bhismadeva. And I am very eager to hear all about it. I'm sure all of you are as well. I've never heard that topic even mentioned before, or even this angle mentioned before. So it's something new for me, definitely, and something very exciting. Look forward to it. So with that, I'll pass it on to Radhika Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, thank you so much, Madan Gopal Prabhu. Always good to be back on the Tobacco Forum and be with so many good friends here. My obeisances again to everyone here on the call. Let's begin. Om Jnana Timirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Preshthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So, the topic, I wanted to say something about the topic. We are coming up to Gita-Jayanti, of course, on Christmas Day. And it's the day Krishna spoke Bhagavad Gita. And so it seemed natural to prepare for that event by speaking a bit about the Gita. At the same time, also yesterday was the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year. And today is the beginning of Uttarayan, the day in which the sun moves to its northern course. This day starts to get lighter and brighter. And we know from Srimad Bhagavatam that when Bhismadeva, the great grandsire of the dynasty of the Kurus and Pandavas, when he was, when he was on the bed of arrows and the Mahabharata war had ended, then he was there waiting for his departure, for the end to come, and he, at that time, Krishna and all the rishis and sages, as well as the 5 Pandavas, came to his bedside, so to speak, but it was a bed of arrows, and were present for his departure. And at that time, Maharaj Yudhishthira received from him wonderful instructions on dharma and what it means to be a king, particularly. And then after that, just as the sun, it says, moved in its northern course and Uttarayan began, then at that point, all the great-grandfather Bhismadeva fell silent, and he focused his meditation on Lord Krishna and prepared to depart this world. Now, there's some confusion about when Uttarayan, when the sun enters its northern course, because often in India, it's considered to be Makar Sankranti in January, 14th, that it happens every year. And I looked this up a little bit. I'm not an astrologer or an astronomer, but I looked this up a little bit. And apparently January 14th used to be the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice. But because something called the progression of celestial bodies, this actually changes over the centuries and over the millennia. So there's a slight distinction in terms of when it is now and when it was back in Bhishmadeva's time. But anyway, close enough. Either way, it's close enough. So what I thought was, since it's the speaking of Bhagavad Gita coming up and Bhishmadeva's departure, why not bring the two topics together and talk about Bhishmadeva's view of the Bhagavad Gita? And the source for this is, of course, Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 9, where Bhismadeva, in the course of his prayers to Lord Krishna, describes very wonderfully, he remembers the conversation between Krishna and Arjun on the battlefield. So there are a couple of places, at least in Srimad Bhagavatam, where Bhagavad Gita is mentioned, it's remembered. One of them being the when Krishna departs this world, then Arjun remembers the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. And Prabhupada has a very nice purport there describing it. But this is also another place where the Gita is remembered. And we see Bhishmadev's perspective and his memory of Bhagavad Gita, which is quite nice. So that's the reason for the topic. And what I thought we could do is start off by reading the verses and translations for Bhishmadev's remembrance of the Bhagavad Gita, but also a few of the surrounding verses, because this is where he remembers not just the Gita, but also the entire scene of Krishna as Parthasarathi, as the charioteer of Arjun. And actually, he describes this scene beautifully. Krishna, as the chariot driver of Arjun, is the preferred mode of vision of remembrance for Bhishmadev, that scene of Krishna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. So his memory, his remembrance is very intense. His description is very beautiful. And Prabhupada's translations and purports are gorgeous as well. So let's read the verses, the translations for about 9 or 10 verses, and I will read the purport, but only for that one verse which specifically refers to Bhagavad Gita. Okay, so that's the plan, and I shall now share my screen. So everyone, please recite along with me. Of course, keep yourself muted, but recite along with me. The Sanskrit is so wonderful here, the translations as well. So just before we get into the discussion of the points and the intellectual aspects of the talk, just take some time to relish Bhishmadev's mood. Just keep in mind the context. He's on a bed of arrows, which would be a position of great pain for just about anyone. He's seeing Krishna right before him, surrounded by Krishna's most wonderful devotees, the Pandavas. So here we are, text number 30 of chapter 9, called The Passing Away of Bhishmadev in the Presence of Lord Krishna. Tadopasing sanghritya gira sahasranir vimukta sangam mana adi purushe Krishne lasatpita pate chaturbhuje purasthite milita drigvyadharaya. Thereupon, that man who spoke on different subjects with thousands of meanings, and who fought on thousands of battlefields, and protected thousands of men, stopped speaking, and, being completely freed from all bondage, withdrew his mind from everything else, and fixed his wide open eyes upon the original personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, who stood before him, four-handed, dressed in yellow garments that glittered and shined. So there's so many things one could say about these verses, and this is not the main topic, but I want to just point out one thing here, which is that strikes me, which is the fact that he fixed his wide open eyes on Krishna. Now, keep in mind that this is a moment of intense meditation for Bhishmadev. It's also, he's entering into a state of samadhi, essentially, and he's getting ready for the moment of death. And yet, when he's meditating on Krishna, he's doing so with wide open eyes. I think it's worth noting that as Vaishnavas, as those who practice on the path of bhakti, we are mystics with open eyes. It is often said that mystics or yogis are those who keep their eyes closed and they meditate. And that form of yoga is considered to be closed eyes, half closed eyes. But the bhakti yogi, the Vaishnava, is a different kind of yogi, one who even in moments of intense meditation likes to keep their eyes open. And often when people will come to the temple, for example, they'll go there and they'll sit down and they'll close their eyes to take in the atmosphere. But as devotees, we have every reason to keep our eyes open because the beautiful form of the Lord is there. And so why not have darshan? Another way in which we might understand this wide open eyes is that a Vaishnava's eyes are always open to the world. Even when we take a particular role in society like sannyas, for example, or vanaprastha, which is giving up social connections more or less. Even then, Vaishnav sannyas does not entail rejecting engagement with the world. There's always a sense of how do I serve Krishna and other living entities who are part and parcel of Krishna, and particularly by giving them transcendental knowledge. And so basically we might say that Vaishnavas are mystics with open eyes, or yogis with wide open eyes. I find it very significant that even at this moment of death, when one might want to close their eyes, Bhismadeva is keeping his eyes not only open, but wide open, so that he can drink with his eyes the beauty of Krishna's form. Something very similar is described with the four Kumaras, who are initially impersonalists when they go to see Lord Vishnu. And we might imagine that they have spent many, many hours, days, even years with closed eyes. And yet when they go to see Lord Vishnu in Vaikuntha, it's said that they drank the Lord's form with their wide open eyes. Right? So again, this is very much the mood of a devotee upon encountering the Lord. So that's verse 30. We move to verse 31 here. Vishuddhaya dharanaya hata shubhas tadikshaya eva shugata yudhashrama nivritta sarvendriya vritti vibhramas Tushtavajanyam visrajan janardanam. By pure meditation, looking at Lord Krishna, he at once was freed from all material inauspiciousness and was relieved of all bodily pains caused by the arrow wounds. Thus, all the external activities of his senses at once stopped, and he prayed transcendentally to the controller of all living beings while quitting his material body. And now comes Bhishmadeva's words. Shri Bhishma Vacha iti materupakalpita vritrishna bhagavati satvata pungave vibhumi swasukham upagate kvachid vihartum prakritim upeyushi yadbhava pravaha. Bhishmadeva said, "Let me now invest my thinking, feeling, and willing, which were so long engaged in different subjects and occupational duties, in the all-powerful Lord Shri Krishna. He is always self-satisfied, but sometimes being the leader of the devotees, he enjoys transcendental pleasure by descending on the material world, although from him only the material world is created." So one thing I want to point out here is I really like this phrase, which let me invest my thinking in the Lord, my thinking which was for so long engaged in different subjects and occupations. So we go through our lives with our minds and feelings and intelligence invested in so many things out of necessity, right? Whether it's our home, our family, our leaking plumbing in the house, or anything. And, that's necessary and sometimes unavoidable, particularly for those of us who have families and are married and so on. And yet there are times, there should be times, there must be times where we not only think of Krishna in the background, but we focus 100% on Krishna, investing our thinking, feeling, and willing in nothing but him. Not just at the moment of death, but in the life of a Vaishnava, hopefully every day, our sadhana in the morning, our evening program, our time for reading of scripture, where we are able to perhaps, hopefully, cut out everything else from our focus, from our intelligence, from our mind, and focus exclusively on Krishna. And that's Bhismadeva is describing, I think, a very nice example for us, because if there's anyone who kept busy with the world, it was Bhismadeva, as we read in the prior verses. Right? Thousands of battlefields, speaking on thousands of subjects, engaging with thousands of people. I mean, this was a man who was really engaged with the world. And yet he is able to take that time for the Lord. Text 33. Tribhuvana kamanam tamalavarnam Ravikara Gauravarambaram Dadhane Vapuralaka Kulavritananabjam Vijaya Sakhera Tirastu Me Navadya. Sri Krishna is the intimate friend of Arjuna. He has appeared on this earth in his transcendental body, which resembles the bluish color of the tamal tree. His body attracts everyone in the three planetary systems, upper, middle, and lower. May his glittering yellow dress and his lotus face, covered with paintings of sandalwood pulp, be the object of my attraction. And may I not desire fruitive results. Perhaps you remember when I spoke on this forum a couple of months ago, I mentioned how bhakti is all about remembering the specifics, right? That impersonalism is all about generalities, and personalism, bhakti, is all about specificities. And here we see a wonderful example of Bhismadeva remembering the specifics of Krishna's form. What is he asking should be the object of my attraction? Yes, Krishna's form, but not just his form. He's saying his lotus face, and not even just his lotus face, but the fact that the lotus face has paintings of sandalwood pulp on it. That's what is particularly attracting him, and the color of his dress. Right? So bhakti is all about specificities, noticing the specifics, rather than the generalities, which so attract the impersonalists. Yudhi turaga rajo vidhumra vishvak kachalulita shamavarya lankritasye mama nishita sharair vibhidyamana tvachi vilasat kavachestu Krishna atma. On the battlefield where Sri Krishna attended Arjuna out of friendship, the flowing hair of Lord Krishna turned ashen due to the dust raised by the hoofs of the horses. And because of his labor, beads of sweat wetted his face. All these decorations, intensified by the wounds dealt by my sharp arrows, were enjoyed by him. Let my mind thus go unto Sri Krishna. This purport, although we won't have time to read it today, is really amazing. Just these next couple of purports. Prabhupada describes the particular mood in which Bhismadeva serves Krishna. And this unusual fact, which I think is enough to bewilder, to confuse more or less any religious person. The fact that one of the Mahajans, one of the Lord's greatest devotees, is taking pleasure in the fact that he has caused wounds on the body of the Lord. And as we'll see in the next verse, caused blood to flow. And that the Lord is enjoying that relationship, that experience. And Prabhupada goes further in the purport by quoting from Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and describing how this pain from his arrows felt to Krishna like the wounds caused by the bite of a lover. When in intense affection, when a lover bites the body of the beloved, that causes pain, no doubt, but that pain is actually pleasurable. This is how Krishna felt the arrows of Bhismadeva, and that pain. Or like the showering of flowers, it's also described. So this is, you have to be a very special devotee to be able to serve Krishna like this, and for Krishna to actually enjoy it. That's a pretty big deal. Krishna doesn't take wounds from everyone. Sapati sakhi vacho nishamya madhye nija parayor balayor ratham niveshya stitavati parasainikayo rakshna ritavati partha sakhe ratir mamastu. Such beautiful, beautiful Sanskrit here. In obedience to the command of his friend, Lord Sri Krishna entered the arena of the battlefield of Kurukshetra between the soldiers of Arjun and Duryodhan. And while there, he shortened the lifespans of the opposite party by his merciful glance. This was done simply by his looking at the enemy. Let my mind be fixed on that Krishna. Okay, now comes the Bhagavad Gita verse. Vyavahita pritana mukham niriksha swajana vadha vimukhasya dosha buddhya kumati maharad atma vidya yayash charanarati paramasya tasya mestu. When Arjun was seemingly polluted by ignorance, upon observing the soldiers and commanders before him on the battlefield, the Lord eradicated his ignorance by delivering transcendental knowledge. May his lotus feet always remain the object of my attraction. Purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. The kings and commanders were to stand in the front of the fighting soldiers. That was the system of actual fighting. The kings and commanders were not so-called presidents or ministers of defense as they are today. They would not stay home while the poor soldiers or mercenaries were fighting face to face. This may be the regulation of modern democracy, but when actual monarchy was prevailing, the monarchs were not cowards elected without consideration of qualification. As it was evident from the battlefield of Kurukshetra, all the executive heads of both parties, like Drona, Bhishma, Arjun, and Duryodhan, were not sleeping. All of them were actual participants in the fighting, which was selected to be executed at a place away from the civil residential quarters. This means that the innocent citizens were immune from all effects of fighting between the rival royal parties. The citizens had no business in seeing what was going to happen during such fighting. They were to pay 1/4 of their income to the ruler, whether he be Arjun or Duryodhan. All the commanders of the parties on the battlefield of Kurukshetra were standing face to face, and Arjun saw them with great compassion and lamented that he was to kill his kinsmen on the battlefield for the sake of the empire. He was not at all afraid of the giant military phalanx presented by Duryodhan, but as a merciful devotee of the Lord, renunciation of worldly things was natural for him, and thus he decided not to fight for worldly possessions. But this was due to a poor fund of knowledge, and therefore it is said here that his intelligence became polluted. His intelligence could not be polluted at any time because he was a devotee and constant companion of the Lord, as is clear in the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Apparently, Arjun's intelligence became polluted because otherwise there would not have been a chance to deliver the teachings of Bhagavad Gita for the good of all polluted conditioned souls engaged in material bondage by the conception of the false material body. The Bhagavad Gita was delivered to the conditioned souls of the world to deliver them from the wrong conception of identifying the body with the soul and to reestablish the soul's eternal relation with the Supreme Lord. So Prabhupada gives such a nice one-sentence summary here of the purpose of the Gita. I'll read it again here. The Bhagavad Gita was delivered to the conditioned souls of the world to deliver them from the wrong conception of identifying the body with the soul. So the first purpose is to help us distinguish between the body and the soul. And secondly, to reestablish the soul's eternal relation with the Supreme Lord. Once we know who we are, then who are we related to? And that's Krishna. Atma Vidya, or transcendental knowledge of himself, was primarily spoken by the Lord for the benefit of all concerned in all parts of the universe. Okay, I'm just going to quickly read 2 more verses to finish this section here of his prayers, where he's envisioning Parthasarathi. Svanigamam apahaya mat pratignyam ritamadhikartum avaplute rathastha dhritarata charanobhyaya chaladgur haririvahantumibham gatottariya. Fulfilling my desire and sacrificing his own promise, he got down from the chariot, took up its wheel, and ran towards me hurriedly, just as a lion goes to kill an elephant. He even dropped his outer garment on the way. So one thing I really like about this verse is how he's comparing Krishna to a lion and himself to an elephant. Now, on the surface, one might think, well, this is rather arrogant of a devotee to consider himself like an elephant before the Lord. Why doesn't he say, the Lord is like a lion and I'm like a rabbit? But the reality is that he's actually, this is his mood in relationship with Krishna, right? That his rasa with the Lord at this moment is that of virya. Virya rasa is one of the secondary rasas. And his mood is, I have to put up a good challenge, so Krishna has a good time fighting with me. It's like doing a wrestling match with with a friend or with your kids. Unless you put up a good match, it's not fun, right? Even though you know that the fighting is only between friends. So the point is that, elephants and lions, they're actually a really good match. And I would say half the time, okay, we don't have much experience of this here, but in places like East Africa, you can go and you can actually see this kind of thing happen. And the lions will jump up on top of the elephant and grab it by the neck. And it's a kind of a 50-50 toss-up, right? Sometimes they're able to drag down the elephant. Sometimes they catch the legs and cause the elephant to trip and fall, and then the elephant's done. But occasionally, the elephant is so strong and so heavy and powerful that they'll throw the lion off of their back or leg and keep moving, or crush the lion. That's always a danger in catching the leg, is the lion can be crushed underneath. So the point is, this was a good match between Bhishma and Krishna. This wasn't an easy thing, even for the Lord, on purpose. Of course, ultimately, everything is easy for Krishna. But in the mood of this relationship, it's a good fight. And just to signify that even further, Bhismadeva is relishing the fact that Krishna lost his upper cloth along the way and ran to him bare-chested. Okay, one more. Shita vishika hato vishirna dangsha kshataja paripluta atata yino me prasabhama bhisasara madvadhartham sabhavatu me bhagavan gatir mukunda. May he, Lord Sri Krishna, the personality of Godhead, who awards salvation, be my ultimate destination. On the battlefield, he charged me as if angry because of the wounds dealt by my sharp arrows. His shield was scattered and his body was smeared with blood due to his wounds. Okay, there's actually one more, the last one here. And then his vision of the battlefield of Kurukshetra, of Krishna's Parthasarathi, ends at this point. Vijaya Ratha Kutumba Attatotre Dhritahaya Rashmini Tachri Ekshaniye Bhagavati Ratirastu Me Mumurshor Yamiha Niriksha Hata Gata Swarupam. Now, this is an amazing, amazing verse, and I want you to try to envision the scene because Bhismadeva describes it better than anyone possibly can. At the moment of death, let my ultimate attraction be to Sri Krishna the personality of Godhead. I concentrate my mind upon the chariot driver of Arjun, who stood with a whip in his right hand and a bridle rope in his left, who was very careful to give protection to Arjun's chariot by all means. Those who saw him on the battlefield of Kurukshetra attained their original forms after death. So this is Krishna as Parthasarathi. And you know, there are sometimes, perhaps you've had this experience, that there are sometimes moments in your life which are so intense, they're so profound, perhaps joyful, perhaps fearful, where they're seared into your memory. And you can remember them like it was yesterday. Like you can remember every little thing about that time, about that moment. The sounds, sometimes even the smells or fragrances, the scene as it's laid out. And for Bhismadeva, this is one of those moments in his life where he remembers it exactly as it was. He can see the fact that Krishna's normally jet black hair has turned ashen, gray, because of the dust from the hooves of the horses. He can remember the beads of sweat on Krishna's forehead. He can remember the blood coming from his wounds. He can remember which hand Krishna held what item in. Everything is like crystal clear. Of course, I'm sure he had a wonderful memory to begin with. But this is one of those times, because you see, it's the culmination, it's the fruit of his devotional service. This is how he wishes to remember Krishna at the moment of his death, is as Parthasarathi, as Vijaya Sakhe, as the friend of Vijaya or Arjun, or he calls him Partha Sakhe, friend of Partha, Arjun. And so he gives such a wonderful model of what it means to have darshan of the Lord, right? When we go to the temple, which unfortunately these days is quite difficult to do, but when we have darshan at the temple or even online, this is the standard to which we're aspiring, right? Is Bhismadeva's standard. That we see the Lord with so much particularity and so much closeness that every little thing about his earrings and about the way his nose ring is and the way his necklaces are situated, his feet, do they have tulsi on them? Do they have flowers on them? All of those things we can notice. And in fact, our ability to have that darshan increases as we become more and more expert in our devotional service and more practiced in bhakti. Initially, it's very difficult to actually see Krishna, even in the form of the deity. I know in Boise, when I was growing up, there was someone who used to come to the temple every week on Sundays without fail, offer their obeisances and put the money in the hundi. And, you know, we tend to do these things as a ritual. You have the darshan, you know, you put your head down, darshan kar liya, matha tek liya, kaam khatam. And your work is done. And then you leave. And he came like this for, 6 months. And after 6 months of coming to the temple, one Sunday, he came up to me and said, "Oh, you changed the dress of the deities today. They look so wonderful. They look so different." And of course, every week we change the dress, right? Without fail, every Sunday. And yet, in his practice of bhakti, for the first time, he saw Krishna and the difference in the way he looked. That may seem very elementary to devotees who are experienced. And yet, in many ways, we're the same way, right? We see Krishna, but do we actually see him? Do we pay attention to him with the focus, with the intensity that Bhismadeva is doing here? With a focus to the degree that when we encounter the moment of death, maybe whenever we do, even if it's 50 years from now, that we will be able to recall that darshan as if it was yesterday. That's the standard of darshan that Bhismadeva is showing us here. right? That he can remember an event like that as if it had just happened, even though he was in the middle of a battlefield. He was probably being attacked from all sides and arrows being thrown, and his life was under threat by none other than the Lord himself. And yet he can remember it with utmost focus. So this is darshan. Now, a few more words I want to say about Bhismadeva and Bhagavad Gita in particular. You see, the Bhagavad Gita, as we all know, is a classic of world literature. There's a professor at University of Chicago by the name of David Tracy, who in one of his books, he says, he gives a definition of what makes something a classic of literature. What he says there, I think, is very interesting. One thing is that he says a book that is a classic of literature is one that has an excess of meaning, an overflow of meaning. So in other words, no matter how many times you read it and how many persons read it, when you read it again, you always find some new meaning there that you did not recognize before. Every acharya in history practically has commented on Bhagavad Gita in some form or another. And yet there's always something more for the next acharya to say. We may have read the Gita over and over again, and yet each time we read it, there is something fresh that emerges from it. As Gandhi also said in that famous quote on the back of Prabhupada's Gita. Every time I read it, fresh meanings, new meanings come to me. So a classic is a work that has an excess of meaning, an overflow of meaning. There's no point at which you can exhaust everything there is to know. Like with a travel guide, for example. Travel guides tend not to be classics. You read it, you get the information you want, and you put it on your bookshelf and it's over. That's it. So he says it needs to have an overflow of meaning. It should be relevant across vast periods of time. So not just in the 19th century, not just for a few decades until the next new novel comes out, but is something that is read across vast periods of time and across cultures. So it speaks to more than just one culture or civilization. It has the ability to speak to people across cultures, across civilizations. And he's practically describing Bhagavad Gita when he describes these characteristics of a classic. The Gita has been read and studied and enjoyed and appreciated across the world, across thousands of years. And there seems to be no end to what you can get from the Bhagavad Gita. And each person who's read the Gita and studied it, whether it's philosophers, scientists, historians, artists, Europeans, Americans, Indians, Chinese, everyone who's read the Gita, they all come to their own understanding for why the Gita is useful to them, and their own areas of what is the favorite, the best aspect, they think the supreme teaching of the Gita. Gandhiji, for example, he felt that the pinnacle of the Gita, the peak of the Gita, right? Do you know which verses he felt were the most important in all of the Gita? It was actually chapter 2, text, I think it's 54 onward, where Krishna speaks about the Sthita Dhimuni, the sage of steady mind. Arjuna asks Krishna, Sthita Pragnasya ka bhasha. What is the way in which the sage who has a steady mind, Sthita Pragna, steady intelligence, how does that person walk? How do they talk? How do they sit and stand? What is their consciousness like? And Krishna describes the sage of steady mind as one who is equal in happiness and distress and steady in all things and being able to see the world with equanimity. And Gandhiji says, this is the essential teaching of the Gita. These are the most important verses. In fact, he says that the author of the Bhagavad Gita had nothing further to say after this. Nothing important further to say after this, which is, of course, something we do not agree with, because Krishna wasn't wasting his time with another 16 chapters. But that's the extent to which Gandhiji considers those verses important, to be kind of the pinnacle of the Gita. Most Western thinkers have said that the pinnacle, the climax, the most important sections of the Gita are, perhaps you can guess, is chapter 11, Krishna's vision of the universal form, the cosmic form, the Vishvarupa. And from an outsider's perspective, it makes sense, right? I mean, they often say, Western authors and commentators, philosophers reading the Gita often say, this is the real Krishna. This is where Krishna actually shows who he is. So it's God's full revelation of himself. From a Vaishnava perspective, it's actually not, because we see it in terms of Arjuna. And Arjuna was not satisfied by that vision. He actually found it to be pretty scary and problematic and wanted to go back to Krishna's beautiful two-handed form. But this passage has fascinated so many thinkers and writers. One fine example is Robert Oppenheimer. Perhaps you know who he is. He was the lead scientist on the Manhattan Project, the scientific project that led to the creation of the atomic bomb, which was eventually dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and changed the course of war forever. When that first atomic bomb was tested in New Mexico at Los Alamos Laboratories, it was called a Trinity test. And Robert Oppenheimer saw the awesome, fearsome, terrible power of the bomb in that test. He quoted 2 verses from the Bhagavad Gita, both from chapter 11. One was Sanjay saying, if 1,000 suns were to rise in the sky at the same time, that would be the power, that would be the brilliance of this universal form. And the second verse he quoted was the famous one, when Arjuna asked Krishna, who are you and why have you come in this form? Krishna answers, Kalosmi sarvakshaya krit praviddho. Time I am, the great destroyer of these worlds. The translation that Oppenheimer had was said, death I am, because the word kala can mean death also. Death I am, and I have come to devour all these worlds. And he felt that matched the bomb pretty well. In fact, he loved the Gita so much, when he studied at University of California in Berkeley, he took Sanskrit courses there, just so he could read the Gita in the original. And he always used to keep a pink bound copy of the Gita, his personal copy, on his bookshelf, right above his desk to refer to. He even named his car, nicknamed it Garuda, after Lord Vishnu's carrier. So chapter 11 has always been a favorite for many people. But for Vaishnavas, for Bhakti yogis, and particularly for Bhismadeva, the focus of the Gita is elsewhere. And that focus is a result not of a preconceived agenda that might be of interest to the reader. Right? So some people have read the Gita because they wanted to promote nonviolence, like Gandhiji. And so they found what was useful there for that purpose. And the Sthita Prajna, the sage of steady mind, is an ideal example of that nonviolence. Others in Gandhiji's time, in his own time, thought of the Gita as providing justification for violently, forcefully removing the British from India. And so they found that message in the Gita. Everyone found what they needed. But the Vaishnavas ask, what is it in the Gita that is important to the speaker of the Gita himself and to the listener of the Bhagavad Gita. And so when Vaishnavas look for those verses or sections that are most important, when we ask what is most important in the Gita, we choose verses that are important based on the Gita's own internal structure, its internal logic. Those verses that Krishna or Arjuna themselves flag as being of most importance. So take, for example, Vaishnavas often consider the four essential verses of the Gita to be chapter 10, texts 8, 9, 10, and 11. Okay. Now, this is easy to remember. Normally, I struggle to remember verse numbers. I can remember verses, but I can't remember what numbers they are in a book. But this one is easy because the first of these four important verses is chapter 10, text 8. That's 10.8. And if you remove the decimal point, right, you get 108. So you can always remember that verse, the beginning of that verse. So Krishna, he describes himself as the source of the material and spiritual worlds. He says, anyone who knows this about me, loves me with feeling, worships me with feeling. And I, in return, give them the knowledge in their hearts by which they can come to me. I destroy with the shining lamp of knowledge the darkness born of ignorance. Now, these verses are, of course, important, and one could point to them and say, well, you're devotees, right? You're bhaktas. So naturally, you like those verses which talk about bhakti. But if you look at why these verses are important based on the structure of the Gita itself, we find something very, very important, which is that it is after these four verses that for the first time, Arjuna decides that he is convinced by Krishna's words, that he has a transformation that is not only an intellectual transformation, but clearly an emotional one as well. He says right after this, Param Brahma, Param Dhama, Pavitram Paramam Bhavan, Purusham Shashvatam Divyam, Adi Devam Ajam Vibhum. These verses in the Sanskrit are like explosive. They're like someone is just in the midst of a revelation, of a euphoria. You are the supreme Param Brahma, Param Dhama, Pavitram, Paramam Bhavan. Again and again, he's saying, you're the best, you're the highest, you're the supreme Krishna. And so we see that at this point, Arjuna says that I'm convinced by what you're talking about. I know who you are. Right? It's a great, before this, everything Arjuna says is slightly skeptical. He's like, well, you said this first, and then now you say this. This is contradictory to me. Actually, you want to, can you explain this a little further? I'm more interested in this subject. He's asking questions. He's skeptical. He's not, faithless, but he's skeptical. And he's inquisitive. But at this point, there's no question. This is the first point in the Gita where Arjuna does not have a question or comment. He's just in a moment of praise. Another verse that we consider to be crucial, another section of the Gita rather, is chapter 9 of Gita. So many of our favorite verses, Patram Pushpam Phalam Toyam, Yat Karoshi Yadashnasti, Rajavidya Rajagoyam, they all come from chapter 9. And again, someone can say, well, this is just, you like bhakti, you choose the verses connected to bhakti. What's new? But here again, Krishna himself indicates to us that what's happening in chapter 9 is something unusual. He begins that chapter by saying, Idam tute guhyatamam pravakshyam yanasuyeve jnana vijnana sahitam yajknyatva mokshase shubhat. This most secret of all knowledge. This, one who understands this knowledge gets liberation. Then again, chapter 18 of Bhagavad Gita, you've heard the verses again and again. Sarvada manmana bhavamad bhakto madhyaji mam namas. Sarva dharman pratyaja mamikam sharanam vraja. Once again, Krishna makes it so clear. Before these two verses, he says, Sarva guhya tamam bhuya, shrunume paramam vacha. Listen to my high teaching. Why am I telling you this? Ishto sime dridameti. Because ishto sime, because I love you so much. You are so dear to me. Ishta means beloved. Ishto sime dridam, so much. That's why I'm telling you my paramam vacha, my highest teaching, instruction. And then he says it's the most secret. And then he said, which is essentially the last verse of chapter 9, which he also called the greatest secret. For Bhismadeva, this is the key of the Gita, right? If we look at the structure of the Gita itself, it is the relationship between Krishna and Arjuna. The fact that at the end of the Gita, Krishna says to Arjuna, I love you so much, ishto sime dridamiti. This is why I'm teaching you. And he tells him, please, you love me back. Manmana bhava madbhakto madhyajina mam namastu. It's that relationship between Krishna, who's Vijaya Sakhe, Partha Sakhe, and Arjuna. That's the focus of what Bhismadeva is thinking about. That's the focus of what he's remembering. That's the heart of his whole vision. He's saying, what is that relationship between Krishna and Arjuna? And when that relationship, that's when just meaning emerges. When we understand it in terms of the speaker, in terms of the listener, and in terms of the context of the battlefield itself. And so you notice that in the that we read, Prabhupada says something very interesting. He says that last sentence of the purport we read, he says, where does it go? Atma Vidya, or transcendental knowledge of self, that is of Krishna, was primarily spoken by the Lord for the benefit of all concerned parts of the universe. He is translating Atma Vidya as not knowledge of the spirit's soul, but knowledge of Krishna. This is, again, so nice because it shows the contextual nature of the Gita. That our focus is to say, who is the speaker of the Gita? The word Atma is in Sanskrit is a reflexive pronoun. Okay, so it doesn't just mean self, it means yourself. It refers back to the speaker. Atma Prem would mean love for oneself. Okay, Atma is the equivalent of myself in English. So when Krishna is speaking about Atma Jnana, he's speaking about not just knowledge about the self in us, but knowledge of himself. He's referring back to the speaker himself. And this, I think, epitomizes the Vaishnava's approach to the Gita. Anytime we read a verse, we always ask the question, who is speaking? And in fact, this is a litmus test for commentaries on the Gita. A couple months ago, again, when I spoke on this forum, I described what I felt was a litmus test for translations of the Gita in chapter 4. If you want to check on the quality of a commentary on any explanation of the Gita, ask yourself the question, how do they translate the word aham or mam? That is I or me. The words that refer to Krishna himself. If they translate those words as me or I means the self within all beings, or if they talk about the self within Krishna, or the self behind Krishna, or any other roundabout way of translating I other than the simple way that we use in conversation. If I say, I want a glass of water, it means the person you see standing in front of me with eyes, mouth, face, nose, all of that. If any other way, then you know that there is some agenda, personalist agenda brought into the Gita. For a Vaishnava, the most important thing about the Gita is the fact that Krishna, 2 hands, yellow glittering garments, with beads of sweat on his face, the bridle rope in right hand, the bridle rope in his left. That the friend of Arjun, is the speaker. If we get just that fact right, then practically anything we read in the Gita is going to be on the right track. It's going to be as it is. And if we get that little thing wrong, who's the speaker and who's the audience, we can't quite get it there, then everything we read is going to be tinged with that impersonalist agenda. And so when we see Bhishma remembering the Bhagavad Gita, what is he remembering there? He is remembering the speaker and the listener, and giving us that vision of happening. And because he's doing that, he's showing us, by doing that rather, he's showing us how is it that a wonderful devotee, how a Mahajan approaches the message of the Gita. As a classic work, you can get so much out of Bhagavad Gita for anything you like, for any goal or agenda and it may not even be wrong. It may be something very nice and virtuous. But if we want the Gita's highest result, if we want its deepest meaning, then we should approach the Gita in the way that Bhismadeva shows us here, by remembering Arjuna and his friend. So I will stop here and see if there are any questions or comments for a few minutes. Thank you all so much for your attention.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Thank you for a wonderful class. We have a couple of questions on the chat. So Shyam Kunda Prabhu asks,
yes,
Bhishmadeva, being a great devotee of Lord Krishna, relates to Krishna in which of the 5 primary relationships? There's 2 questions. And why is Bhismadeva seeing Lord Krishna with 4 hands? That's described in the Bhagavatam. If you can, which of the primary, and then which is the 4 hands?
Yeah. So the 2 questions are of course related. Thank you, Shamkun Prabhu. Excellent questions. Bhishmadev, he is really. So there are 5 primary rasas. Are of course servitude or shanta rasa, neutrality, servitude, friendship, and parental love, and then amorous love, conjugal love with Krishna. And as far as I understand, and I could be wrong about this, but as far as I understand, Bhishmadev's primary relationship with Krishna is in the mood of service, of dasya bhav, and obviously tinged with awe and reverence. He likes to remember Krishna as the friend of Arjun, but with 4 arms, as Chaturbhuja. Before in the verses we have, he asked to see Krishna's 4-armed form. So he likes to remember Krishna in that form of majesty and opulence. At the moment in the battlefield of Kurukshetra, that sthai bhava, that fundamental mood of service, is then temporarily overlaid with one of the secondary rasas, namely virya rasa. So the characteristic of the secondary rasas is that they're not always there. So you're not always in a chivalrous mood with anyone, right? That's a temporary mode. Or laughter or jokingness, that's temporary. You're not always laughing. So Dasya Bhav with the secondary rasa of Virya rasa is how I understand Bhishmadev expressing his mood. Now, even though he's in this Dasya Bhav, he clearly has the ability to appreciate Krishna and other rasas. So his greatest appreciation is for Krishna's friendship with Arjuna. He's mentioned it 2 or 3 times in the verses we read. Vijaya Sakhe, Partha Sakhe. You are the friend of Partha. So friendship, he really relishes that. Even though he's not one to sit on the same bed with Krishna and laugh and joke. That's not their typical connection. And if we had continued reading the verses, he even appreciates Krishna's conjugal lila, Madhurya Ras, with the gopis in Vrindavan. So he's able to appreciate from a distance that, yes, Krishna's Vrindavan lila is something really special. Sometimes we say, 10th canto is the most special part of Bhagavatam. And it is Vrindavan lila, because you see that even devotees in other rasas appreciate repeatedly that Vrindavan lila. Queen Kunti does it. You remember when she remembers Damodar lila? She says, this is really amazing to me, very confusing. Ati vidambanam, that you would be tied down by a rope and afraid of your mother. Bhishmadev is remembering Vrindavan lila. Uddhav remembers in the 3rd canto. He says, Krishna's Putana lila, for example, you remember? So everyone relishes that, but from a distance. It's not his mood in Vrindavan, in Brajalila. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Prabhu. I think we have time for one more question. So okay. Gail Mataji has a question. Gail Mataji, please go ahead and can unmute yourself and ask your question. Haribol, Gail Mataji, can you, yeah, there you go. Okay.
Yeah, I was trying to do it from my phone because I have bandwidth issues. But anyway, my question is, Bhishmadev knows that Krishna is God. And so, I know there's Yogamaya, but I just wonder how he is really able to relish his fight with Krishna, knowing that really he has the power to defeat him. And therefore, you can't enjoy a fight where the person is letting you win. So is it really just because of Yogamaya that he's able to relish this fight on the Battle of Kurukshetra, or what?
So I presume so, that it's through Yogamaya that all of this becomes possible, because we know that the emotions that the Lord experiences in relation to his devotees are very real, as in when Krishna is running from Mother Yashoda's stick, he's actually afraid. I mean, he's not just pretending to be afraid. He's not faking it, because there's no enjoyment in faking it. And Mother Yashoda is really upset at Krishna and really worried about whether he's going to turn into a morally good, upright young man or not, right? So Yogamaya makes all these things possible. And certainly Yogamaya is at work in any relationship with the Lord and his devotees. At the same time, I mean, there's also good examples of, like when I wrestle with my kids, for example, they know very well that I can defeat them. And yet they give it their best, and I give it close to my best. And it's still a lot of fun for them, even though they know very well that when dad decides that the fight is over, the fight is over, right? So it's also not inconceivable to think that Bhishmadev always remembers the fact that Krishna can defeat him and slay him in an instant and still relish the fight, still relish the wrestling match. And indeed, he seems to know, he seems to remember, because after he gets Krishna to break his promise, in fact, I think we ended one verse early because he talks about Krishna breaking his promise. His intention is to get Krishna to break his promise, right? He's thinking, Krishna promised I'm not going to fight on the battlefield, but today, by threatening his devotee, Arjun, I'm going to make him choose between the promise that I protect my devotee and the promise that I won't fight, and see which one he chooses, and he's going to have to break one. So that's his sense of victory. He knows Krishna can kill me, but hey, in the process, if I can get Krishna to do something he was determined not to do, that's a pretty big win, right? Just like when my kids fight with me, when they wrestle with me, if they can get me to go, ow, that hurt, or whoa, they can push me to the floor, for example, by pushing me when I wasn't expecting it, they're really happy, right? That's a win for them. So in the end, Bhismadeva knows, because after Bhismadeva gets his win, that is, he gets Krishna to break his promise. That's what he says himself. That was his goal, to get Krishna to break his promise. Once he gets his win, Bhismadeva, after that, he puts his hands out and he says, okay, come kill me. I know you can win. Like, if you want to kill me, it's happening. But I don't mind, right? It was a great fight and I got you to break your promise. So now I'm happy to be killed by you. Right? So it works. It works. That relationship works. And whether Yogamaya is there and how much she's acting, I'm not sure, honestly. I don't have the real answer to your question. But just to say one way or the other, whether he remembers Krishna's supremacy at that moment or doesn't, it looks like he does remember, but we don't know ultimately. But whether he remembers or not, that moment is definitely still relishable. Thank you for that wonderful question.
Thank you. Thank you, Radhika Raman Prabhu.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. Thank you very much for that thorough and
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gail Mataji, for the nice question. And Radhika Raman Prabhu, you know, all of us here love you very much, and we love it when you come personally to Tawako and give your seminars. And of course, this year we've had issues for anybody traveling to our temple and whatnot, but we are very grateful that you came here. We've been thinking of you today all day. I'm actually looking out this window and I'm looking at the College of William and Mary. I'm right here in Williamsburg. You just came for a little break. This is where your whole stomping grounds are, all these universities in the country. All day we're thinking, yes, Radhika Raman Prabhu used to be a lecturer here, professor, yes. So you are very dear to our hearts, all of us here, and we are grateful to Nilmani Prabhu for always, keeping you in our loop and pulling you in. So I'd like to request Nilmani Prabhu to offer our first word of thanks, and then we'll open it up to everybody else.
Okay, thank you, Prabhu. I run out of ideas how to thank you, Prabhu, but it was again a wonderful class, and it's so nice to hear this angle of Bhishma, the Bhishma Stuti prayers. I think that must be one of the most beautiful parts of Srimad Bhagavatam. And even if you don't understand them, when you just hear them verses being recited, they just sound so nectarian and so wonderful to hear. But when scholars like you can kind of deep dive in there and extract some really wonderful meaning and open our eyes to that, that's even more relishable. So thank you again, Prabhu. Can't wait till again next time. We'll schedule you again soon in the coming months. Looks like we're going to be doing this Zoom Sangha for some more time at least.
Indeed. Thank you, Nilamani Prabhu. Always so happy to see you and all my friends at ISKCON Tawako. So it feels very much like a family.
And so just want to announce that this week is a little bit of a shorter week because of the holidays, so we won't be having any sessions on Thursday or Friday. We do have one more session this week with the Jayadvaita Swami tomorrow as we continue Canto 2, so please join for tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. And then after that, the next session will be next Monday. So thank you once again, Radhika Raman Prabhu. And dear devotee, if you'd like to unmute yourselves and say a quick Hare Krishna, you may do so now. Hare Bol.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you, Radhika Raman Prabhu.
Hari Prabhu, you're here. Long time.
Hey, good to see you, Prabhu. I'm in New Jersey now, Prabhu.
Oh.
Back in New Jersey.
What's
up, Prabhu? Yeah.
Krishna, thank you.
Nice to see you. Radharani Mataji.
Hare Krishna, thank you, Prabhu. Nice class.
Thank you, Radhika Raman Prabhu. Wonderful.
Thank you. Wonderful. Awesome. Very
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Prabhu. Very kind.
Please come and visit.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Dandavats.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai. Hare Bol.
Hari Hari
Jai.
Bol.
Govinda ki jai. Go Bhavani.